Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into Chapter 1 of a massive historical mystery from early Chinese history, one that completely flips how we understand systems of power. Have you ever stopped to wonder how a vast, incredibly structured society could just hold itself together without a single written law, without a police force, or even without basic philosophical debates about right and wrong? Well, we're traveling back to the early Zhou dynasty, a period that pulled off exactly that. We're going to unpack a brilliant analysis by scholar Yuncheng Zhou, specifically looking at how the Zhou ritual order actually functioned. And look, this isn't just dusty, ancient history. This explainer is going to reveal the hidden, almost invisible mechanics of how human beings actually organize themselves. Okay, picture this. It's a totally cinematic scene from the spring plowing ceremony. The year is 895 BCE. It's the third day of the third month. The Zhou king stands before the ancestral tablets, steps forward, and just drives a plow into the yellow earth. The very second he strikes the ground, the local lords standing behind him perfectly replicate the gesture. And instantly, like a massive domino effect, an entire agricultural cycle begins. Millions of farmers from the Yellow River Valley all the way to the Han River Basin just start their spring planting. There's no bureaucratic memo sent out. There's absolutely no debate. Nobody is asking why the king gets to kick off the season. They just act.
And honestly, this perfectly sets up our paradox for today. How on earth did this huge, complex society function in absolute perfect equilibrium without anyone ever writing down or arguing about the rules? Nobody questioned if the king's little performance actually made the crops grow, or if the exact way the lord stood was right or wrong. It's not that those questions were illegal or forbidden, it's that they were literally unintelligible to the people living at the time. It just didn't compute. But how is a society like that even possible? Well, to figure this out, we actually need to borrow a really powerful concept from modern political theory.
Section 1. The Rules of the Game. To solve this ancient puzzle, scholar Yuncheng Zhou points us to a brilliant insight from 1955 by the philosopher John Rawls. Rawls identified something he called constitutive rules. Now, these are super fascinating because they don't just restrict your behavior, they literally invent it. They create the roles, the actions, and the moves that simply wouldn't exist at all without the rule itself. In a society running on constitutive rules, you don't justify what you're doing by pointing to some outside logic, you justify it simply by pointing to the internal rules of the game you're playing. To really wrap our heads around this, think about the contrast between two types of rules we see every single day. On one side, you've got regulative rules. Think of a speed limit. Driving a car is an activity that already exists completely independently of a speed limit. The rule just swoops in from the outside to tell you how fast you're allowed to go. But on the flip side, we have constitutive rules. Think of chess. You don't ever ask why a knight moves in an L shape, right? The rule literally creates the knight. Without that rule, there's no knight, there's no move, there's no game at all. The Zhou dynasty wasn't running on speed limits, it was running on chess rules. And that brings us to an absolutely crucial point about the Zhou dynasty. The ceremony didn't symbolize authority, it constituted it. Think back to that plowing ceremony for a second. The exact spatial arrangement of the lords standing behind the king, that wasn't just a theater performance representing a hierarchy. It was the hierarchy, physically enacted right there in the dirt. To ask why that performance held authority would be like asking why a judge's legal verdict carries authority. The act itself is the authority.
Section 2. Pillar 1. Ritual as living authority.
So this invisible chess game rested on three massive pillars. The first was ritual, known as Li, which basically acted as the living architecture of their power. This was the physical medium where authority actually lived and breathed. We aren't talking about abstract ideas of hierarchy here. We're talking about exact physical choreography. You stand exactly 30 paces behind the king. Not 29, not 31, 30. You pour wine from a very specific bronze vessel, called a jé, at a highly prescribed exact angle. You recite your family lineage all the way from the founding ancestor through 7 generations with 0 errors. Talk about pressure. But why be so obsessive? Because going through these exact motions didn't just show your respect, it actively brought the authority of the whole empire into existence. If you didn't do the physical actions, the authority just vanished.
Section 3. Pillar 2. Kinship as invisible infrastructure.
Now, if ritual was the physical choreography of this power, kinship was the invisible infrastructure that made sure everybody actually showed up to the dance. Think about our modern world. We sign an employment contract and listen to our boss because of a legal regulative framework, right? Well, in the Zhou dynasty, political roles were mapped directly onto family ties. A minister's duty to obey the king wasn't some external legal rule he had to follow. It was the literal definition of his role in the family.
That kinship obligation didn't constrain what a minister would otherwise do. It constituted what being a minister actually was. It was this massive, scalable network of inherited roles where obeying the government was literally indistinguishable from being a good son. Section 4, Pillar 3, Heaven's Unspoken Mandate.
So, holding all of this tightly together was the ultimate justification. Ritual gives you the actions, kinship gives you the people, but what actually justifies the whole system? That would be the mandate of heaven. And it operated completely silently, relying entirely on tangible, observable outcomes. It legitimized the rulers without a single debate. Why? Because the outcomes themselves were the verdict. If you had a bumper crop that year, or you won a swift military victory, boom, that was all the proof anyone needed that the invisible system was working flawlessly. If physical reality was prosperous, heaven approved. End of story. It was a perfectly self-reinforcing loop of legitimacy that just naturally absorbed any minor hiccups along the way.
Section 5, Order without philosophy. So here we have an entire society operating strictly through tacit participation. The Zhou people pulled off these rules flawlessly by doing rather than by knowing. Nobody ever sat them down to explain the philosophy behind it all. They just learned it by living it, participating in it from the time they were kids. The rules were never explicitly written down. They were transmitted purely by doing them. And this brutally effective, invisible equilibrium worked seamlessly for 4 whole centuries. Seriously, let that number sink in for a second. 400 years. 400 years of massive societal coordination across vast territories with millions of moving parts, functioning perfectly without ever needing to codify a single regulative law.
Which brings us to a really profound realization. Harmony is invisible. The early Zhao era didn't need philosophy because harmony was just their unquestioned everyday reality. Think about it. You don't sit around analyzing the rules of breathing while you're breathing comfortably, right? You only start thinking about oxygen when you're choking. Philosophy only exists when things break down. And eventually, thanks to population booms, new tech like the crossbow, and shifting economics, this invisible constitutive practice did start to crack and decouple. The famous 100 schools of thought, all those legendary figures like Confucius and Lao Tzu, they only showed up as a desperate, urgent response when this 400-year-old invisible practice finally collapsed. They had to invent philosophy just to figure out how to put society back together. So, I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If perfect order is truly invisible and we only ever notice the rules of the game when the game stops working entirely, what invisible constitutive rules are dictating your life right now without you even knowing it? What are the things you do every single day? The roles you play, the authorities you just naturally obey, simply because they are the unspoken rules of our modern game. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, to keep questioning the invisible rules around you.